Good day. We will be discussing percentages, how to convert percentages, as well as how to find what a certain percentage is of a whole number. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is discuss how to convert a decimal number into a percentage. When we want to convert a decimal number, what we want to focus on is how many digits appear after the decimal point. Now, I currently have two numbers after the decimal point. That means it now falls into the hundredths column. If you remember, or if you look at my previous videos on decimals, when there are two digits after the decimal point, that means it falls under the hundredths column. And if I convert that into a fraction, I will then have it as 100 as the denominator. Now, if there were only one digit, let's say it were only 0.4 and only one digit after the decimal point, that means my number would then fall into the tenths column and my denominator would be 10. Now, in this particular case, when we change the decimal number into a fraction, I will count how many digits there are, make the two digits over 100, and it just so happens that when we have a number that has a denominator of 100, it is then considered as a percentage. However, if we are to consider numbers that are not two digits after the decimal point, we then need to look at how we will convert that into a percentage. Okay, so just a few moments ago, we did discuss when we have two digits after the decimal point, which simply does convert quite easily into a percentage. However, when we now look at whether there are less than two digits or more than two digits, how will we then convert this into a percentage? So currently, I have two digits after the decimal point, which then tells me that because I have two digits, it falls into the hundredths column. And anything out of 100 can then be considered as a percentage. In this case, it is 45%. But now let us look at when I have one digit after the decimal point. Now, I have written down 0.4. This 0.4 tells me that it falls into the tenths column. When this falls into the tenths column, it means that it can be divided into 10 portions. So when I convert this into a fraction, my denominator will be 10, and this number after, or the digit after the decimal point, will be written as the numerator. Now the point is not for us to convert this into a fraction, but to make it a percentage. So that will then require me to multiply by 100. We need to multiply by 100 because all percentages are out of 100. Now the other thing is that we need to consider, I have this number as a fraction and this number as a whole number. I will put 100 over 1 because we want to have fraction multiplying by fraction. So it makes it easier in terms of our calculations and to simplify later on. Now, the first thing that we are going to consider is whether you will be doing cross simplification or you will be straight multiplying. Now, I will show you both of these methods. It's very important to know how to cross simplify because at a later stage when we are dealing with word problems, it does make it a little bit easier to deal with smaller numbers as opposed to large numbers. Now, when we cross simplify, you will look at the opposite numbers. So that means I'm going to look at 100 and then I will look at 10. Those two will group together. And 4 and 1 would group together if you were to simplify those two numbers. The other one is when you want to straight multiply, we will simply look at 4 times 100 and 10 times 1. So, let us first start with our straight multiplication because that is the easiest and the most common way that you know and up until now. That means we are going to say 4 times 100 and 10 times 1. 4 times 100 gives us 400 and 10 times 1 gives us 10. At this point, it's still not a percentage, and that means we then need to divide. If you are not sure on how to divide, you can do one of two methods. So you could cross out our zeros, and that means we are left with 40%. Or you could, instead of doing that, you can then use long or short division, which then would require a calculation on the side. In this particular case, it was easier for us then to cross out the zeros because it just so happened that both the top and the bottom number had zeros. If that were not the case, you would use, like I said, short or long division. The bottom number will go on the outside and the top number goes on the inside. The bottom number is what we are dividing by, and the top number is what will be divided. Now, as we do in normal division, we will do the check. Can 10 go into 4? No. Can it go into 40? It goes in 4 times. And our 0 goes up high because 10 cannot go into 0. That again leaves us with 40%. Now, that is if we are doing straight multiplication. If we were to do the other method of cross simplification, that means we are going to still follow the first step of putting 100 over 1, but then we are going to look at the opposite numbers. When we look at the opposite numbers, we're going to ask ourselves, what is the highest number that can go into both 10 and 100? That means that we're looking for a common factor. Please do not confuse this with a multiple. The multiples of 10 would be your times tables, or the multiples of 100 would be your times tables. When we're looking for a factor, that means it is a number or numbers that can go into both of these numbers without leaving remainders. So for example, it cannot be a number greater than 10 because 20 cannot go into 10. So when you do the check, you will ask yourself, can 2 go into it? Before I actually start with 2, let us first consider the number 1. We don't look at the number 1 as a common factor because 1 is a universal factor. That means that every number will go into 1 and those numbers will remain themselves. So for example, if I were to say 1 goes into 10, how many times has 1 go into 10? 10 times. That means I'm still sitting with the number 10. Nothing has changed. My numbers have not gotten smaller, neither has my 100 gotten smaller. So, when we're looking for the factor, we're obviously not going to be considering 1. So that requires you then to do the check. Remember that your factor, your common factor, cannot be greater than the smallest number that you have. So in this particular case, my smallest number between 10 and 100 is 10. So I will ask myself the question, can 2 go into those numbers? Yes, but is there a higher number? Can 4 go into them? No, because 10 will have a remainder left over. Can 3 go into them? No. Can 5 go into them? Yes, but is there a greater number than 5? Can 10 go into them? Yes. So my highest common factor between the two of them is 10. I will then divide both of these numbers by 10. That then leaves me with 4 over 1 times 10 over 1. And then in my final step, because I now have smaller numbers, I will then do straight multiplication. So 4 times 10 gives me 40, and 1 times 1 is 1. Therefore, my percent in the end is 40%. That was very simple. If we are to use 3-digit numbers, I would then follow a similar process by first converting that number into into a fraction, and then multiplying it by 100. Now that we have considered converting decimals into percentages, we can now look at converting fractions into percentages. The process is fairly similar to that of decimals. However, we do have one less step here. So again, we're going to multiply by 100 because we do want a number out of 100 because percentages are out of 100. So my first step is to multiply by 100. Because 100 in this case is a whole number and this is a fraction, I want to ensure that I'm working with fractions only and that I don't only have a fraction and a whole number on the other side. So we will make the whole number a fraction. That means I end up with 1 times 100 and 8 times 1, or 1/8 times 100 over 1. Again, we're going to follow the step that I previously spoke about, where you will either cross simplify or you will go straight into straight multiplication. So it is up to you what works best for you. I find that generally working with smaller numbers makes it a lot easier for me to then get to my final answer. Now, that means if I'm going to be looking at cross simplification, the two numbers that I need to be looking at is 8 and 100. I am going to look for a common factor between 8 and 100. It doesn't mean that you're always going to find the highest common factor or what you've previously known as the greatest common factor. You can also use a common factor. A common factor could be a number that is less than the greatest number. So for example, we can use 2, so we divide by 2 and we would divide by 2 there. This just means that at the end my numbers will be slightly larger than what I would have liked, but I'm still going to get to the same answer. So I have 1 over 4, because 8 divided by 2 is 4, times 50 over 1. I now do straight multiplication, and this gives me 1 times 50 is 50 and 4 times 1 is 4. In the end, I do need to simplify by dividing. So the number at the bottom will always go on the outside and the number at the top will go on the inside. You will do either short or long division depending on what works best for you. I do prefer long division because it's easier for me to track if I've done something wrong, should there be any remainders. Now I do the check. 4 goes into 5 once. 1 times 4 is 4. I have 1 remainder, bring down my 0. 4 goes into 10 2 times. That gives me 8. I have 2 left over. Now if you have a remainder at the end and you want to see if you can make sure that you've worked out all of your numbers in your division sum, add a decimal point and a 0. Your decimal point goes up high and you bring your 0 down low. Then I ask myself, how many times does 4 go into 20? It goes in 5 times, and 5 times 20 is 20. Therefore, my answer is 12.5%. Now, in the natural way of doing any mathematical sums, we're not always going to be converting simple fractions or simple decimal numbers into percentages, but also we're going to look at what is a percentage of a particular number. That word of that we have there immediately indicates to you that we need to multiply. Now, the first thing you're going to do is we are first going to change our percentage sign into a fraction. When we change a percentage into a fraction, that means it has to go over 100. The simple rule is that when there is a percent sign, I have 2 zeros on either side and the 1 in the middle. That tells me that it's out of 100. Now, The first step, convert your percentage into a fraction. Second step, multiply by the given number. Now, my 200 is the given number. At a later stage, I will also refer to this particular given number in a different term, but we are still talking about the same number. Now, once we multiply by 200, we want to have a fraction multiplying by a fraction. Currently, we have a fraction multiplying by a whole number. So for us to have fraction multiplying by fraction, I will then put my 200 over 1. Like I did in my previous examples, we will first cross simplify by looking for the highest common factor before we straight multiply. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because 40 times 200 gives us quite a large number to work with. By us looking for the common factor between 100 and 200, it just makes it easier for me to then work with a much smaller number. Now, the common factor between 100 and 200 could be 20, it could be 10, it could be 50, it could be 100. But remember, the common factor that you choose must not be greater than the smallest number I have. So the smallest number between 100 and 200 is 100. Therefore, it cannot be greater than 100. Between 100 and 200, my highest common factor is 100. So I will divide 100 by 100 and 200 by 100 as well. That then leaves me with 40 over 1 times 2 over 1. Then we do straight multiplication. 40 times 2 gives me 80 and 1 times 1 is 1. Therefore, 40% of 200 is 80 Rand.